So this is my short keynote lecture on what we call triangular trade. This is connected with the notion in Unit 3, the last part of Chapter 20, where we talk about Atlantic trade. And what we call it is triangular trade. So if you look at the graphic on this slide, you can see why we call it triangular trade, is that if you follow each passage, if you follow each direction or voyage in this trade cycle, you'll see that it forms more or less a triangle. So hence the name triangular trade. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, so basically there were many food crops that were indigenous to the Americas, and I list 4 of the most important ones here: potatoes, corn, beans, and squash. And these were indigenous or native to the Americas, and they provided a very good food source for Europeans because if you notice, one thing that all of these crops have in common is that they have a high nutrition value and they have a high calorie value. And so you can feed more people with these crops and you can sustain a larger population. And so these 4 crops actually lead to a population increase, a population boom in Europe. In fact, they call it the agricultural revolution in Europe. That starts to happen by about the 1700s. So it's really interesting. So again, these crops are high nutritious, high calorie, and they're grown on plantations in the Americas, and then they ship to Europe. In addition to the staple foods like potatoes, corn, and so forth that I just mentioned, you also had luxury items like sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, chocolate. Obviously, some of these can be eaten, like sugar, and coffee and chocolate, but they are not essential staple foods. In other words, you can live without coffee, you can live without chocolate. I know it sounds crazy, but you can. So we call them luxury goods. Luxury meaning that you don't have to have them, but you want them because they're good things. Everyone, likes a little bit of sugar, chocolate. Tobacco was a luxury item, and so forth, okay? Now, these also made their way on ships to Europe to be traded in Africa for slaves, okay? Our next slide, then. We go back to the graphic, okay? So let's look at what made its way from where. If you look on the left side of the graphic, you'll see the east coast of the continental United States, okay, North America. Now, from America over to Europe, you had sugar, tobacco, and cotton, all those things that I just mentioned, making their way to Europe. Now, then the products that were made from those raw materials would be taken down to the west coast of Africa. Now look to the right side of the graphic and you'll see the west coast of Africa. And so those things like textiles and rum and other manufactured goods were traded in West Africa for slaves, who were then sent. Now follow the arrow going left. Again, those were the slaves who made their way to America, and that was called the Middle Passage because it was essentially the middle of this trade cycle. But if you look at it, you can see how this cycle sustained itself. It perpetuated itself. It was a self-repeating cycle.